Our presentation is about grief and headhunter's rage. The first slide I decided to do is the difference between grieving in the present day versus other mourning rituals. The first bullet point I noted is how grieving is more of a mourning of sadness, not necessarily leading to anger. Typically, we all come together as society, and the most prominent emotion we feel is sadness when we lose someone, not necessarily leading to rage. That's through, as the next bullet point I noted, was more advanced technology. We have social media where you can post on digital platforms and all come together and reflect those who have died. It's not necessarily like there's other coping mechanisms you can use. And then another bullet point I noted was symbolic reflecting lost ones. This is through therapy, which is now evolved. You can go, you can talk to someone, you can cope. And then memorials where you all come together. You reflect on those who have died. You feel they have passed in a different spiritual manner, not necessarily having to use headhunting as the only way to let them pass, which is what the Island God people believed, and other religious rituals that are practiced. In contrast, the Island God's grief, headhunting was a way to let the dead pass, which is where you decapitate those who have already died, and it was a way to honor those that have died, and they believed that rage is the solution to cope. This is because they didn't have as advanced coping mechanisms that we have in modern society. And then the last bullet point I noted was collective practice, which, let me go back to it. Which is where it is very similar to how we cope now, where we're all society connects on those who died, but there's just a little more. They believe that they have the connection through decapitating, which allows them to share the same values and rituals and allows them to bond as a society. The next slide I did is main points of the slideshow. The first point I noted was about how cultural rituals are connected to not only sadness, but emotions like grief and rage. As I said previously, they didn't have as much solution, they didn't have mechanisms to cope, so rage and grief was a way to let those they have lost pass and move on. And my next bullet point I noted was how headhunting was closures for those who have lost headhunting, whether you agree with the brutal style or not. Although it can seem animalistic, it was their way to let those who have died pass, and it was a way of closure. It wasn't necessarily unhumanistic, even though in our present time we don't view that as a norm. That was their norm back then. And then the next point I noted was about how headhunting can be traced to concepts such as Edward Taylor's theory of animism, which is basically seeking a solution to the spirits that died through anger. Basically, he believed that all living things have a spirit, and since those who have died still have a spirit, they believed they weren't able to pass unless their heads were decapitated, and it was a way to bring peace. And then the next bullet point I noted was prohibition of headhunting causing a culture shift. So when headhunting was banned in the Island God tribe, a lot of them resulted in changing their religion. Most went to Christianity, and this allowed for societies to find a different process of emotion, not just rage. It allowed them to understand how grief and deal with the pain they are going through another mechanism to cope without having to resort to headhunting. The last that I did was discussion questions. For the first discussion question I have, how does the Island God grieving ritual differ from what you've experienced or heard from your own culture or others? And how has your new and profound knowledge affected these preconceived notions about cultural mourning? The second question is, how can Island God practice of headhunting be traced back to Edward Taylor's concept of animism? And then for the third, I have, what are some rituals that can be traced back to headhunting? And then the fourth, I have, what role does personal experience have when questioning the Island God's practice of grief? How does culture and experience have such an impact on your own beliefs and mourning? And then lastly, I have, What does the Island God practice of headhunting tell us about the connection between emotions and cultural rituals? The question I'm assigned the answer is how some rituals can be traced back to headhunting. So personally, I believe that military losses can be traced back to headhunting because although it's not actually involving headhunting, it's still they're grieving through rage. The memorials are coming together and it's a way for them to have spiritual closure. Much in fact how headhunting did process their emotions, just not involving decapitation, but it's more of it still involves grieving, but it's more rage about how they died, and they still reflect and come together the same way.